much easier to forget that than to remember it. But I could stand up here and tell you that if you give people sound information, and I believe that science is the contemporary language of mysticism. I think science is what demystifies the mystical. And if you tell people every time they learn something new, they make new connections in their brain. That learning is forging new synaptic connections. And if you concentrate for 1 hour on a piece of information and you keep reviewing it over and over again, you'll double the number of circuits in your brain. Your interaction with the environment leaves footprints of consciousness and neural circuitry. But if you don't review that information and repeat it and keep it alive in your mind, those circuits will prune apart within hours or days. So if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining and sustaining those connections. And as you interact with your colleagues and friends and you share information and you listen to the knowledge that's being given to you, I want you to know that you're changing on a biological level, and we've measured that now, and I can say that with confidence. And if people learn that information, I believe they should be able to explain it to someone next to them. And when people can explain that understanding completely, build a model of understanding, they're installing the neurological hardware in their brain in preparation for an experience. And the more they understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, the how becomes practical and easier. If those people then apply that information to their life, if you leave here and you take that philosophical, theoretical, intellectual information that you learned from somebody else's experience, and you make the decision to apply it, to personalize it, to demonstrate it, to initiate knowledge in some way, if you get your behaviors to match your intentions enough times, if you get your actions equal to your thoughts, if you get your mind and body working together, you're going to run into a new experience. Your goal, your vision of the future. And experience enriches circuitry in the brain. We know that also. And when you're in the midst of the experience, all the sensory information that's rushing back to your brain is causing jungles of neurons to organize into networks and patterns. And the moment those neurons string into place, another part of the brain makes a chemical. And that chemical is called a feeling or an emotion. And the moment you feel empowered, the moment you feel successful, the moment you feel free, the moment you feel worthy from the experience, now you're teaching your body chemically to understand what your mind has intellectually understood. So we could say that knowledge is for the mind and experience is for the body. And in that moment, you are embodying the truth of that philosophy. And it also means that if you leave this place and you never apply it, but you understand it intellectually, you're still the philosopher. Initiating then for the experience causes us to chemically instruct the body to understand what the mind has intellectually understood. And that's the moment the person is changing their genetic destiny. And I can stand up here and tell you that if you do that properly, you'll change your future genetically. We've measured it. So once mind and body are aligned to a new future, people who get really good at anything just keep reproducing the experience over and over again consciously. And they do it so many times that it becomes subconscious. And the repetition of any action will neurochemically condition your mind and body to begin to work as one. And when you've done something so many times that your body now knows how to do it better than your conscious mind, you've mastered that knowledge. It's a state of being. You know how you do it, but you don't know how you know how any longer. It's automatic. It's natural. It's easy. It's innate in you. You've become it. So you are here to go from philosopher to initiate to master, from knowledge to experience to wisdom, from mind to body to soul, from thinking to doing to being, to learning it with your head, applying it with your hands, and knowing it by heart. And when you're that expert, you'll wear it. You'll wear who that person is. And people think that they want to be wealthy, or they want to be healthy, or they want to be free. But it's who you actually become in the process. And the process of change is the overcoming of the old self. And if you think 60 to 70,000 thoughts in one day, and you do, and 90% of those thoughts are the same thoughts as the day before, in your life, the same thoughts are going to lead to the same choices. The same choices are going to lead to the same behaviors. The same behaviors are going to create the same experiences. And the same experiences are going to produce the very same feelings and emotions, and those same familiar feelings are going to drive the very same thoughts. And your biology, your neurocircuitry, your neurochemistry, your hormones, and even your gene expression stays the same because you're the same. And that principle in neuroscience that says that nerve cells that fire together wire together, if you keep thinking the same way, keep making the same choice, keep creating the same behaviors, the same experiences for the same emotions, you begin to hardwire your brain and condition your body into the same information neurologically and chemically. And over time, the persons get stuck in the past. So then, new thoughts should lead to new choices. New choices should lead to new behaviors. New behaviors should create new experiences. New experiences should create new feelings and new emotions, and that should inspire new thoughts, and that's creative, and that's evolution. And so, that 95% of a person, by the time they're 35 years old, who's been thinking and acting and feeling the same way, biologically becomes that person. And your personality creates your personal reality. That is it. That's it. So the present personality who's sitting here today called you have created, or in the process of creating, your personal reality, your life. That means if you want to create a new personal reality, you got to change your personality. Nothing changes in your life until you do. Period.
Exactly.
So if the present personality here today called you has created the present personal reality called your life, and you had to change your personality in order to change your personal reality, then you would have to start thinking about what you've been thinking about and change it. And those are unconscious thoughts that sneak by people's awarenesses unnoticed and unchecked. You have to pay attention to how you act, the habit that you have of being yourself, and become so conscious of that unconscious self you wouldn't go unconscious to it again. And then you would have to look at the emotions that you live by every single day, the feeling that you call you, and you would have to decide, does this emotion belong in my future? So if you wanted to truly be wealthy or abundant, you couldn't feel unworthy. Just an abundant person wouldn't feel that way, and you would get busy catching yourself when you felt that way enough times to stop feeling that way. And the question is, how many times do we have to forget? Or we stop forgetting and we start remembering? How many times do we have to go unconscious until we start becoming so conscious that we don't go unconscious again? My interest, then, has always been to prove to people how powerful they really are. That there is always a feeling in people who are interested in evolution that never seems to go away. And that feeling is telling them there's more to reality than this dream. For many people, it's the feeling that keeps them awake. So I thought, on my journey, if I gave people the right information, and I gave them numerous opportunities to experience it, and numerous opportunities to overcome themselves, and combine quantum physics with neuroscience, with neuroendocrinology, with psychoneuroimmunology, with epigenetics and electromagnetism, and build big models of understanding. And if those people could understand what they were learning and explain it to someone next to them, and I could set up the conditions in the environment for them to actually feel safe enough to try it out, I wondered if their biology would change. I wonder if their health would change. In other words, they started to think differently. They started to act differently. If they started to feel differently, they were a new personality. And is it possible that their health condition existed in the old personality and it would just go away? So after a couple years, we started seeing people step out of wheelchairs. Now, I have to tell you that I was more surprised than anybody. And we started seeing people with serious health conditions, MS and lupus and chronic pain and all kinds of mental health disorders all of a sudden get better. Like complete reversal of the health condition. And I knew in that moment that we had to be signaling new genes in new ways. And the latest research in epigenetics says that is the environment that signals the gene. Not your genes determine your destiny, but the environment signals the gene. But I looked around the ballroom, and it didn't look like a really big environment that would signal any new genes. In other words, the environment out here wasn't changing at all. It must have been their inner environment. What were they doing in their thoughts and feelings? What was going on in their inner world? What was making that change? How is the mind influencing the body? We know that the mind influences the body when you live by the hormones of stress, and stress is when your brain and body are knocked out of homeostasis, out of balance. And there's an innate response to return it back to order. But the arousal of those stress hormones, people over time need the arousal. They need the drama. And the rush of adrenaline, the rush of chemistry awakens the brain and body. And so fear and anger and aggression, and hostility and prejudice, and competition drives people in survival. And they're always waiting for the next moment, for the next stressor. And they can think about their problems and turn on the stress response just by thought alone. But it's a fact that the hormones of stress push the genetic buttons that create disease. That means their thoughts are making them sick. That's a mind-body connection. Is it possible then that their thoughts could make them well? I don't know. So we ventured out on a journey. You didn't have to be a monk. You didn't have to do meditation for 40 years. You could eat whatever you want. I don't care. To me, it doesn't matter. I want to see if the mind truly influences the body when people change that. And so we had to look at brains. And you saw Nick. And scientists get into science because of discovery. That's why they initially get into it. And it changes over time because they have obligations and there's grants and competition and papers and all that stuff. But they get in initially for discovery. And what we're discovering right now with our brain science, what we're discovering in people's biology, we are making history over and over again. And it comes in all shapes, all sizes, all colors, all ages. I've seen it on everybody. And so the brain scans that we were doing, we were measuring people's brains before they came to the event, put them through 7 days or 5 days of intense change. And at the end of those 7 days or 5 days, where there are biological changes taking place in their brain, and 100% of the time, we saw people get better. And all they were doing was focusing on nothing. All they did was give their brain a break for quiescence, for order. Pausing for a moment in the present moment and sitting with themselves long enough to like themselves again. Get past all those thoughts, all those emotions, get past all their unconscious way they speak and the way they act. Get beyond all of that. Who's behind that? And become so conscious that you start to change and start to create and want to create a new life for yourself. We started looking at people's brains in real time. What was going on in their brain during the process of change? And our analysis caused us to really begin to understand on a deeper level how to change, what that process looks like. And then we started noticing that people were having arousals that were taking place in their nervous system, where they were producing such incredible energy in their brain, but it wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pain, it was ecstasy. Now, what kind of biology would change if we could measure the blood? And what was going on in the person's heart? We know when a person is stressed out, their brain is disintegrated, disorderly. We know that when they're addicted to the hormones of stress, that their heart has no energy in it, it beats irregularly, it's incoherent. If we teach people how to get coherent hearts and coherent brains, what would be the effect in their biology? And we're still in the process of discovery. And these scientists that I'm about ready to call on the stage will tell you over and over again, it's unbelievable. They will tell you that they run the tests 5 and 6 and 7 times thinking they're going to get a different result. They're changing their belief. The data is changing them right before their eyes. And so I love the idea that common people like you and I can do the uncommon. I like that. And as a result of all the science that we have studied, along with drawing blood, checking gene expression, checking immune regulation, checking heart rate variability, checking the energy in the room, having random event generators, and every single thing that we do points the finger at possibility, at human potential. Along with that, the side effect is seeing changes in people's lives. And I'm not talking about changes that have to do with them really trying to change themselves and their lives. I'm talking about their change they're making for themselves, for the better, for themselves. They stand on the stage and they talk about how they were diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and then at the end of a period of time, they couldn't find the cancer anywhere in their body, or one moment, it disappeared. Now, I watch people in the audience when these people come on the stage and speak, and they are the example of truth. They are the 4-minute mile, right in front of everybody. And that person doesn't look any different than anybody else, and she's speaking truth. I've seen people that were in wheelchairs step out of wheelchairs. We've had blind people see, deaf people hear, more than once. People with all kinds of rare genetic disorders go into remission. And we had to continuously measure, because that is the story that people need to know about how they can make changes for themselves and for their lives. And so we have great evidence in our scientific data. And we have such great evidence in testimony in people that have actually applied it. And I think that this is a time in history where it's not enough to know. This is a time in history to know how. And evidence is the loudest voice. And we run these workshops all over the world for thousands of people. And many times we do all the measurements. Our laboratory is our events. We have the perfect environment to study people. Everybody's doing the same thing. They're getting up at the same time. They're intensely making conscious changes. They're changing their biology. And I can tell you that at the end of 7 days, the changes that have taken place in people's bodies have always been for the better. And I want the scientists, 2 very, very reputable published scientists that from the University of California, San Diego, who are just open-minded, very cool people, come on up here and show you some of that data, just to prove to you how powerful you really are. What do you say? Yeah. So Dr. Mel, Dr. Cody, come on up.
I know. But wouldn't that be a lovely utopian thought?
Exactly.
CD, nice to see him.
There we go.
I got goosebumps.
Here comes the microphone.
This is what I want to change to.
Is it on?
Yep.
Perfect, yeah. Thank you so much for calling us up. I'm Toby. I'm Harold Patel. And before we dive into the data, which Mel is going to present mainly, maybe we do a quick couple of minutes introduction to describe how we got involved, why we got involved, and what we are excited about. You may pick up a slight accent. I'm from Germany originally, and my road to join Joe was basically from the science perspective. So I'm a physician, scientist, and I think that's based on the fact that I like people and I like to understand how stuff works. So I was working at UCSD and the VA, and one thing that I saw a lot of in the beginning in the pain clinics was patients with PTSD. I'm a pain physician, and it was in the early 2000s when people came back from the Iraq and Afghanistan problem. And for me as a scientist that really likes to understand pathophysiology, how things work, it was really a stretch initially to accept the fact that somebody can have an emotional trauma, nothing wrong physically, but they change. Who they are, how they live. Their physiology changes, their anatomy changes. And that kind of opened me up. Yeah, I can show a few pictures here, just showing you that you have physical changes in the brain. That opened me up to the fact that emotion intense emotional experiences can cause physiological changes. So when I was introduced to Dr. Joe through a colleague of mine that I was working with, you can go to the next one. Healing and rewire your brain through meditation made total sense to me. So you can, when I was starting on the disease side, understanding that disease and negative emotions can cause change. It just makes sense that positive emotions should also make change. So I went to one of his events about 2 years ago after he had come and visited with me at the clinics. I saw what Joe just outlined. We had this immense opportunity to have people do the same thing. Because one thing you got to realize with meditation is not every meditation is the same. And if you try to compare meditations, it's always difficult because people do different things at different times for different length. It's the same thing as saying, I want to see if a pill helps with, pick any disease, diabetes, and then grab random medications, have everybody take a different pill and see if it has an effect. You can't really study that this way. So the fact that Joe has this very elaborate way of precisely doing the same every time he does something, he does this in a lot of people, and he does that around the world, is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really dig down and understand how meditation works. And by the way, creating an environment that he has anyways would cost tens and tens of millions of dollars. So it's very unlikely that it's going to be somebody else is going to be able to create this environment. So seeing this unique opportunity, I reached out to Hermel, who was a colleague of mine from UCSD, and got him excited in it. And it started with that. And maybe I'll hand over to you to show the data that we collected.
Yeah. So I'm a professor at the University of California, San Diego in the anesthesia department. And as Toby mentioned, we shared an office for about 8 years. And so after long days of work, we would sit together. He would tell me about his horrible experiences in the clinic, and I'd tell him about all the stuff we were doing in the lab. And so when he met Joe, he said, I know a guy, and I'm that guy. That we do a lot of molecular biology, genetics, cell biology in the lab. And I came into this as a skeptic, right? I'm like, all right, we'll take a look. We did an event in February of 2020 in Indian Wells. I have to admit, I think the samples were sitting in my fridge for 3 months before I even looked at them, because I'm like, yeah, I don't know, who's this Joe Dispensa guy, right? But eventually we started looking, and I'll show you some data. Get settled, 4-hour lecture. Just kidding. I'm going to show you the highlights. I mean, we have data that I could literally talk to you for 8 hours and show you all of the amazing things we found that your bodies can do to your biology, and why that biology is going to change and impact your health, your endurance, your resilience, everything about you kind of thing. I'm going to show you a couple stories of really sort of important discovery. This was our unique opportunity. So I guess I'll get up, it's easier. So the world over the last couple years has been very different than what we are used to, right? We've been dealing with this pandemic, coronavirus pandemic. And so when we did these original samples, they were right before everything shut down. So in February of 2020, we collected all these samples, and then everyone knows what happened in March. We went into this completely sort of shut down state. My laboratory was shut down for about 3 months. And so we were trying to invent things that we could do that would allow us to get back into the lab and start working in different ends of biology. And so we started focusing on SARS-CoV-2 research, like many researchers across the US. And we had these samples from this workshop, so we thought, why don't we throw them on the cells and see what happens? And I'll show you some really cool data. So we did a survey initially. We had people respond all over the world. We had about 3,000 people respond, about 2/3 from the US. And we asked them very simple questions. Were you ever diagnosed with COVID-19? If so, what kind of symptomology did you have? And then ultimately, were you doing Joe Dispensa's meditations? And if you were, what was your practice of it? How long have you been doing them? How often do you do them? That sort of thing. And we started fishing around this data at those two questions. So looking at the experience and tying it to their modality of disease. And what came out of this was shocking, right? So this, I think I can see if this doesn't show it. Basically what you can see is the more experience you have with meditation, so the individuals that had 6+ months of meditative practice, their rate of COVID-19 diagnosis was dramatically reduced, more than 50%, compared to someone who's never meditated. So this shows that the power of the mind to change the body is quite dramatic. You can modify at a global level. The other interesting thing here is we looked at 63 geospatial units across the world. So this previous slide shows you where all of the respondents were from. And so if we had at least 10 responses from a particular location, we counted it. And so this data is an aggregate of 63 locations all over the world where we see this correlation between this meditative experience and the decrease in COVID-19 positivity rate. What we saw in addition to this is that there's a dosing effect. So, if your doctor tells you to take a pill every day and you decide, I don't want to listen to my doctor, I'm going to take my pill every week, you're not going to get better, right? There's this idea. And so we saw a similar thing with dosing. If you meditate once a week versus every day, there's an increased benefit by meditating every day, suggesting that not only is there an experiential aspect of how long you've been meditating, but what that meditative environment is at your home, in your brain, on a daily basis kind of thing. So at this stage, we were thinking, well, we've got this blood from Indian wells. Could we discover some factors inside this blood that may have some impact on COVID disease? And so my lab has studied whole blood from the twin astronauts. So we were involved in the NASA twin study where the Kelly twins, one was up in space for a year and the other was on ground. And we were looking at stress pathways in their blood. So we applied a similar approach to whole blood from these meditators at this event. We focused mostly on the plasma components, and I'll show you some really cool data on this. So this is a volcano plot. It's not to scare anyone. I'm going to give you a brief primer on how to read a volcano plot. Two things you have to keep in mind. It's like a volcano, so the center is not very important. But if something spills over either onto the blue side or the red side, it becomes important. What the blue side tells you is it's a factor that's either upregulated after the meditative experience relative to before they started the meditation. If a dot is red, it tells you that that factor is dramatically suppressed after the meditation compared to before the meditation. Each dot represents a unique factor that we can measure in the blood. And this is just to orient you. So then when we started looking at the data, it was quite striking. So we have a system where we can look at almost 3,000 unique factors in the blood. And so these I call my Mai Tai vacationers, right? So these controls were people that were attending the event but not meditating. They're likely relaxed, hanging out at the pool, drinking all day, and not really stressing out much. And we see some changes, but wait till you see what happens to someone who is a new meditator and then ultimately an experienced meditator. So when we look at the blood of a new meditator, there's a dramatic explosion of factors that includes metabolites, amines, and lipids in that blood. So whatever is happening during that week-long event, your body is changing and your blood is changing. And this blood contains factors that we think will impact your health long-term. When we looked at experienced meditators, these are individuals that are already at a hyper-meditative practice sort of state when they're at home. We saw changes, but they weren't as dramatic as the people that came to the events kicking and screaming, right? A spouse or someone told them that they had to go, otherwise they'd be in the doghouse kind of thing. So this shows you that there is a dramatic effect on blood after a week-long meditative experience. We've done the data, and I don't have time to show you, but what we've also shown is that a new meditator after 7 days starts to look a lot like the experienced meditator. There's this sort of misinformation that we have to be meditating for 6-7 years and develop this long, involved meditative practice to get any kind of health benefit. We can show that a new meditator that's not meditating very long, for 7 days, they can get to a state of what an experienced meditator gets to. So this blood gave us a unique opportunity. So we had this global data that suggested that those people that meditate have less COVID positivity. So now we wanted to fish out a factor in the blood of these experienced meditators and these novice meditators that may protect from COVID disease. So this is what we invented in the lab. In order to work with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, you have to have a BSL-3 facility. You gotta get, all gowned up and go inside. And then there's one facility on campus which had a long line. And so, like any resourceful scientist, I looked in the literature and decided that we would make a fake virus. And so this fake virus has the spike protein from SARS-CoV-2 on the surface. So on the surface, it behaves just like SARS-CoV-2 virus does. The inside, we gutted, and we basically replaced with an expressor for red protein. So when this fake virus, which behaves like SARS-CoV-2, attaches to a cell, and it goes into the cell turns red. And so we can basically track how many cells turn red and get an infectivity rate. So we did this really cool and sort of weird experiment, and the data is quite striking. So these are scanning EM images. So we're looking at a scan on the cell surface. And middle panel, you can see that SARS-CoV-2 virus up close and personal there. So what we did in this experiment is we took blood from a control, a new meditator, and an experienced meditator after their week-long experience. We let that blood sit on these lung cells, which is the primary place where you're going to get infected with SARS-CoV-2,
Right.
and let the cells bathe in this meditative environment that these people had created. These cells have never seen meditation, and we're causing them to meditate by whatever factors are floating around. After that hour of conditioning these cells with this blood from the meditators, we then challenged the cells with this pseudo-fake virus. And then 24 hours later, we looked, and this is what we saw. And my 10-year-old can look at this and say there's a dramatic difference between the control, novice, and experienced, right? If you look at the top image, the control looks not very fuzzy, whereas the novice and the experienced look really fuzzy. And so she asked, where's the virus in the control? And so what we can do with EM is slice through the cell and look inside. And what we see is in the control, all of the virus is inside the cell. But somehow, the meditators are creating a unique factor that prevents the virus from going into that lung cell. It's trapped on the cell surface, right? That's why the cells are all fuzzy. And so we've been fishing around for this factor. This is a network map that we created of about 107 factors that we can identify that relate to potential immunity against this in the blood of a meditator. We've actually identified one. I won't show you that data. The data will be coming out hopefully by the end of this year, where we will identify what that unique factor is and how it's going to change biology for SARS.
Damn.
And so with that, I'll end with this notion of where we're headed with the research that we're doing. There's really this balance between human disease and human potential. And what we're hoping to get is if we can capture enough healthy individuals to see what happens to their body and their blood after a meditative experience, we will create a human mind where we can look at all these disease processes and potential ways to create therapeutic endpoints. I've shown you an example with SARS. We have data to show that we can identify factors that may target cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all of these things. And the